Hey guys, it's Sam. Today we are going to talk about addiction and psychology. I will give a few examples of types of addiction, the stages of addiction, addiction myths, and some facts. We will also talk about what people used to think addiction was from, as well as what it actually causes it. So, first we need to know what addiction is. I have a full definition here that was adapted from the Encyclopedia of Psychology. You can feel free to read that. But basically, in layman's terms, addiction is a condition or state of being controlled by a habit or a substance, whether it be drugs or gambling, etc. A person needs that stimulus to function. Here we've got some examples of addiction. As you can see, addiction isn't limited to drugs or alcohol. I personally found it pretty interesting that people could be addicted to technology or social media. Like today's youth are completely obsessed with their phones and Facebook and validation from their peers, which I could possibly be showing my age here, but that one was pretty interesting to me. There is also caffeine or food. You'll have people who are addicted to work. So while drugs and addiction are a large portion of the statistics that are out there for addiction, there are other things out there that somebody could become addicted to. Here we have the stages of addiction as well as the addiction cycle. A great deal of addiction starts with experimenting. Experimenting will turn into dependence, well, regular use, and then it would be dependence. Dependence is when a person needs that drug to function in their daily life, or they can't do what needs to be done. Sorry about that right there. You can also see that the addiction cycle is pretty much just a non-stop cycle for people who are addicted to something. It will start with an emotional trigger, and from there they will crave that drug, they will go through their ritual, and they will use again, which will then cause guilt, which leads again into the emotional trigger. So that's pretty brutal for them. This also, the stages of addiction, I did get from the Science of Drug and Abuse and Addiction, which is a media guide that they have out there. Here we see what people thought addiction used to be based on. It used to be thought that somebody who was addicted had moral or spiritual problems and needed a better connection with God to quote unquote cure their disease. It used to also be thought that ignorance was a leading factor in somebody being addicted to something, and that going to lectures and educating themselves about it would treat them. I think these are all pretty asinine in my opinion, but yeah, it wasn't until fairly recently that people really understood what addiction stemmed from, or what it rooted from, what it started from. So the fact that people thought that somebody needed to have a relationship with God or go to a lecture would help them with addiction just kind of blows my mind. But these facts right here, oh sorry, not facts, these bullet points were adapted from The Sober Truth by Dr. Lance Dodds, who I have a quote later on in the presentation we will see. Here are the top 10 addiction myths that you can read through if you would like. These are pretty self-explanatory. I thought that they were kind of ridiculous and should be known through common sense, but I am here to educate you on myths and addiction. So if you have any other questions further into addiction myths, feel free to message me. I'll give you some answers. Here we have what's the basis for what addiction is actually based on. We have got the tree of addiction, which is just a depiction of how that works. And over here we have the top one I have is neurons release neurotransmitters caused by drugs. That is a chemical change in the brain. So if somebody were to do a drug, their brain would get used to it, and it would actually change the chemical balance in their brain. So the drugs would release neurons, the neurons release neurotransmitters, hence people needing the drug even more. Majority of addiction is based off of stress. So the anxiety, compulsions, the mental, physical, sexual abuse, mental health, those are all roots of why somebody would be addicted to a substance. Most people don't initially do drugs to get high. They are mostly trying to mask the feelings of something that has happened to them in the past, what they are internalizing. These are all roots of why somebody would turn to drugs or alcohol or whatever it is. This last bullet I have is also the genetic predisposition, which I thought was pretty interesting. I mean, I'd always heard that you're more likely to become an alcoholic if your parents are alcoholics. But to learn that you could be an addict to whatever it is, because if you have a parent or your parents are addicts, you are 8 times more likely to also suffer from addiction. So physical addiction is a biological state in which the body adapts to the presence of the drug. You will need to do more and more drugs or stimulus, whatever it is that the person is addicted to get the exact same feeling that they had before. So by doing drugs, like I mentioned previously, it does change the chemical balance of your brain. It's also that the body will become used to the substance, and that this is what we call tolerance. Another form of physical addiction is where the brain will associate cues to do the drug. So the example I gave was an alcoholic who walks into a bar will feel a pull towards wanting to have a drink. So that's a dangerous situation for somebody in that circumstance. I also listed a couple addiction facts. I know you're not supposed to read bullet points during a slideshow presentation, but I do want to read these to you guys just because I feel that they are pretty interesting. The first one is that addiction is almost always based off of stress, which we did touch on earlier. It is also important to recognize that the cause of addiction is not simply for pleasure, nor does it have anything to do with lack of religion, morality, strength, or character. That is also something else we touched on. It is still being debated that addiction could be a disease or a mental illness. Drug addiction and abuse costs taxpayers roughly $400 billion each year. I believe when I was doing the research on this that this stat came from 2007, so that dollar amount could easily be greater than what it is now. We also have that drug addiction can be linked to at least half of the committed crimes in America, and that many drugs are addictive because of the chemical changes that happen in your brain, which also goes along with what we had said earlier. Here I have a quote from Dr. Lance Stodes, who also wrote the book that I quoted earlier. It is that psychological symptoms can be understood and treated, but not by dealing with them as spiritual problems, lack of education, lack of motivation, or simply faulty thinking. We have failed to help people suffering with addictions because we have failed to understand addictive behavior as a psychological symptom that it actually is. So I thought that was pretty powerful statement, just to know that people have in the past looked at addiction in a way that is not how it actually is. So I do have other information if anybody is interested or wants to know any more. Feel free to message me on our discussion boards. I am willing to give you guys some more information. And here I have my references. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to message me. Thanks, guys.